There are a lot of like unspoken rules in hospitality that when you go and work at a restaurant, it's kind of like you're going to learn it the hard way on day one.
Justin, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man. How are you?
Doing all right. Thanks for hopping on the show.
Yeah, great to be here.
Awesome. So I want to dive right in. Before we do, if you want to just introduce yourself to our audience, if they have not come across your content on their feed, who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Justin Khanna. I went to culinary school in New York, did the kind of traditional path of get my culinary degree, go work in restaurants. And those restaurants from where I was as a young, ambitious, hungry culinarian who kind of just wanted to get my butt kicked in the industry. I went for Michelin kitchens. That was the type of food that got me excited. Those were the kind of environments that I knew would kind of like push me because I didn't come from a restaurant family. I don't have, extensive training. I grew up in Wisconsin where chicken wings and pizza and burgers was kind of like the height of gastronomy. And so I kind of like went face first into that. And where that first kind of manifested for me was like staging. And so I would take the train down to the city, send emails out to restaurants that I was very unqualified to spend time in, but they took me in and I was, for the listener, I was trying to kind of like position myself for an externship at one of these places because that's how my culinary school worked. Worked at places like Per Se for my externship. Then I was on the opening team of this restaurant called Grace in Chicago that went on to earn 3 Michelin stars. And then I went to the French Laundry after that. I then moved to Scandinavia for 3 years. I was working at this restaurant on the west coast of Norway called Lisforket, and I became a sous chef after 10 months of working there, and then basically was running service there for almost 2 years. And then it was time to kind of like start to move back to the US. I was starting to think about like maybe a restaurant concept of my own, but I had also started making content at the time at that restaurant, which I'm sure we'll talk about in this conversation. So I found myself moving to Seattle, and there I started hosting pop-up dinners and making content at the same time. I started my podcast, the YouTube channel with gear reviews and more industry insights, and just kind of like interviewing other professionals really got me excited because I wanted to still continue learning. It wasn't somewhere where I was just kind of like, oh, I have this management experience, so that's just kind of like the end of it. I still, very similar to both you and your listeners, I think that there's this fascination with kind of like how content and the internet kind of like fuse with these kind of like tried and tested organizations and businesses that are restaurants. Restaurants have been around for hundreds of years, but it's just kind of like we live in the age of all of these technological revolutions. And so how does the two marry? And then the pop-ups kind of like led into an event production business because I found a business partner who was basically going to help to supplement some of my weaknesses, but then also it allowed me to kind of like staff up more and have more of a consistent deal flow instead of just kind of like putting up tickets for a pop-up and hoping that guests would come to my thing. My business partner did a really good job of being like, hey, there's 65 guests at this tech company. They want XYZ menu. You write the menu and you just go cook it. And so I could just run that culinary program. It was like kind of a dream scenario for me. And then COVID hit, which was just a wrecking ball for so many, my business included. We had 9 employees. We had just leased a large office in downtown Seattle, like 4 months before COVID officially happened. And so that was just like a whole thing of needing to do online cooking classes and all those sorts of things, which again, really got me into the space of sharpening and refining my teaching muscle, which I really, really enjoyed. And then that led to that business partner moving out of the US. And basically then we decided we were going to kind of like transition that business away. And then I just decided, hey, I'm just going to go full bore into this teaching content thing because I also became a dad 18 months ago. And so there's also like being behind a stove. Kudos to the chefs who do it. It's not something that I think piece of industry news, Christian Puglisi today just came out and said he's divesting from all of his restaurants basically because he wants to focus on family time. And so I think that's also an industry trend we can maybe talk about. But yeah, that's kind of what I spend my time doing is making frameworks, making tools, making resources that can ultimately help the industry to level up and provide better experiences across whatever it is that they do, whether that's a restaurant or a private chef business or even being a cooking content creator. I think those people provide experiences too. So that's what I focus on.
Yeah. So I want to, start a little bit from the beginning, going back to your YouTube, the first video was at Lisforket, those first videos there. So working in those kitchens, one, I want to know what that's like just from your perspective. And then, when did you decide like I'm going to make a video? Was it a gradual thing or was it something you always wanted to do or take me through that, the journey?
So I'll start with the first one, which is the thing that I think strikes people first when they go into those types of environments is kind of in the way that I framed that, which is the environmental change. And so if you're used to, like maybe loud and rowdy, playing music in the kitchen during prep type of kitchens. Fine dining kitchens, some of them definitely do that type of thing, but a lot of them don't. Like I remember the first time I staged at Alinea, it's a quiet, completely quiet kitchen because everybody is so dialed in and just, if we're being honest, like frantically panicking that they need to be set up for service tonight on this completely unreasonable set of prep tasks and components and organization steps that you need to take to make sure that your station is set up to do service. And then the same thing with other things like midday breakdowns. I think a lot of people might, in more of a casual kitchen environment, you clean down at the end of the day. But in some of these kitchens, when you're thinking about kind of like, oh, we're going to reset before staff meal, that was just like a totally mind-blowing thing for me. Where like 3:30, everybody stops their project, all the countertops get wiped down, and we scrub everything. Do you know what I mean? We do the floors like in the middle of the day. That was just a totally mind-blowing thing to me. And so it's like these sets of high standards that I think most people who have any level of ambition or hunger or kind of like drive to improve, it benefits that person to be around those types of environments because it's like, you almost can't help but have it rub off on you, which is really, really beneficial because it shows you what's possible. And then you can kind of like cherry pick. I think that's the thing that people look at these environments. I think that they're like Kool-Aid environments where you kind of have to, and when you're there, that absolutely is the case. You can't be the guy who's throwing your hands up and saying, I don't want to break down today. You absolutely have to kind of like follow the protocol. But I think you can take a little bit of that. And if you do want to open more of a casual wine bar in the future or, any of these little things, you can decide, hey, maybe we're not going to do this part, but we are going to cut the tape on every single thing that we label and put in our walk-in. And that's what's cool about the industry. And then on the content side, this sounds like a bit of a weird backstory, but I'll share it here, which is Norway is unique in that before I moved to Scandinavia, I would maybe get 2 weeks of vacation a year. And for those that work in the industry, especially young people, I was in my early 20s at this time, one of those weeks was spent going home and seeing family. And so I kind of had 1 week a year that I kind of had up to my discretion up until moving abroad. And in Scandinavia, most Copenhagen, Stockholm, Oslo, Bergen, most people get 5 weeks of vacation. So that was number one, which was beneficial. So I had more of this kind of like quote unquote disposable time on my hands. And two, I was working like 12, 13, 14 hours a day at the restaurant, especially on the sous chef side. I was making money, but it wasn't a ton of money. But the kicker was I wasn't spending any of it because I didn't have any time. And so what I spent my time and money doing when I eventually had the ability to do it was I basically decided I was going to travel the world. And so I went to Dubai and South Africa and Hong Kong and Paris and Copenhagen. I went to all these places, which is really cool because I would sometimes do it with my roommate. Some of them were solo trips because when you're in Europe, you're just a quick hop away from those places. I think in the combination of researching where I wanted to travel, I was watching some of the proliferate, and also because I was involved in more of the finance meetings during this time as a sous chef, I was starting to get more into kind of like business content. So a lot of these entrepreneurs were starting to share their ideas online, and I was getting a lot of insights from them. And so I kind of had this thought of just kind of like, what would it look like for me to potentially decide that I was going to share some of my stuff online. I was really into, this was like when Casey Neistat was daily vlogging, if you remember this, kind of like way back in the day. And there's no better time to shoot content than when you're traveling because you're outside of your comfort zone. Everything is new. You are just naturally excited about what's happening around you on a day-to-day basis when you're on the road. And so it's really easy to capture that stuff. And then the story is kind of like chronologically laid out for you. If you're documenting a trip, you don't really have to kind of like force a story upon it. You just have to kind of like recall what it was. That's how I basically taught myself how to shoot content, was capturing these trips. Me and my friend, my roommate, John, he's one of my best friends. We went to Hong Kong. I captured everything. I used that big chunky bit of footage and I edited it into a video and then I called it a thing. And then once I had that skill, I was like, oh, this is interesting because I am also in my day job, basically in charge of changing the tasting menu at the restaurant. And so what if there's a world where I could take this concept that I learned from my chef de cuisine at the French Laundry? We did a daily changing menu at that restaurant. And he always had a dish on the menu that he called the dish of the day. And he would, we'd call it out in the menu meeting at 12:30 in the morning and somebody would name out a set and he would write it down and he'd be like, that's the DOD. That's going to be the dish of the day tomorrow. And he would use that as a way to kind of like get stoked and excited about like, I'm so excited to come in and cook that tomorrow. And so I used that concept to basically try to push myself on the menu to basically be like, what could be a dish of the day? And that was the name of the show that I eventually launched at that restaurant. And super kudos to that chef for basically letting me shoot that content. There was no precedent for me going in and shooting that type of stuff. I remember some of the early videos apologized to everybody's ears because there was no mic on my camera. And so basically audio quality was just in the garbage. But it was one of those things where I got to flex that muscle and learn how to structure my ideas, how to come off on camera, how to basically like, and all of that stuff has been a learning thing for me, where I looked at each of these things: editing, hosting, scripting, any of the things of structuring a show as skills that I could ultimately get better at. And that's what you'll see me talk about in Repertoire, where it's like each of these little experiences can build upon another and make you a better professional. And so, yeah, happy to continue more on the content, but that's kind of the genesis of how it started.
Very cool. So it seemed like, based on what you were telling me, like the turning point was those Seattle pop-ups. I'm sure the videos helped, but it seemed like it helped you discover your voice kind of outside working for these like heavy hitters, Noma, Grace, per se, Keller and Renee Redzepi and those kind of guys. So what was that like, and how did you find your own kind of perspective and voice working for these kind of big, really well-known brands?
It's a big moment when you are the one where the structure and the concept and the individual specifics and details fall on your shoulders. Because up until that point, you can kind of push that onus on, oh, well, this is chef's dish. This is their idea. This is somebody else's doing. And I'm just following instructions, which I think some people call like that's the transition that you go from cook to chef. I don't necessarily agree with that, and we can maybe talk about that. I do think that there is that moment of me having to take a step back and ask, what does my food actually look like? Like if I really take all of the baggage of, Lise Fourquette as a concept was on the west coast of Norway, seafood focused restaurant. French Laundry, the ethos is there. Like the legacy of that place is we have a garden across the street, we're in Napa, and we're basically going to like exemplify this place. Same with Noma, you know what I mean? Like new Nordic cuisine. And so that's what I realized when I started to write some of my own menus is it is a little bit of this hodgepodge of, it kind of looks like the plating of per se, but you have these kind of like Scandinavian, minimalist elements that you're doing. You're using some of these ingredients because you're on Seattle and you're on the water and you're using seafood. I'm also half Indian. My dad's from Delhi. And so I was kind of like, can I infuse some of that into it? Should I infuse some of that into it? Because like I've never cooked that food, at least in a restaurant setting before. I've cooked it at home and with some of my Indian relatives, but it's never been something that I've actually leaned into on what does my food look like. And so, yeah, it is this moment of like I talk about creative constraints a lot in my content with chefs, because when you have wide open range, or if you're a private chef and the client says, Joe, just do whatever you want, that's actually a really hard place to be creatively, because you almost have too many options. And it's kind of like, how do I make decisions creatively here? And so the series of pop-ups that I was doing was basically an effort to try to figure out what, does my food look like? How do I like to structure a tasting menu? How many courses do I put pressure on myself and say it needs to be 9 courses like the French Laundry was, but then you really start to take a step back and make decisions, which etymologically is this kind of like to cut off, like you have to cut things away to make a decision. And so it was a really beneficial time for me because it made me realize specific things about how I like to approach food as a chef. And to be honest with you, DJ, I don't necessarily know if I ever landed in a satisfying place with that. I don't think I ever landed in a place where I'm like, I'm satisfied with the food that I did. It taught me a lot. And where it puts me at now is being much more in a place of actually pushing a little bit back on this idea of like chefs putting themselves on a plate. I'm much more gravitated now in thinking about like individual concepts and how does the concept potentially develop an identity for itself. And I have some frameworks that I share with folks around this as I work with them individually one-on-one, because I think that can be sometimes more valuable as we think about like, me as the chef, I have this idea, but if I scale this, I'm now putting the onus on maybe you, DJ, as the line cook on the fish station. And if this dish is like this, this story about this stew that my grandma made, blah, 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 and I'm putting that on you and saying, hey, you're in charge of this, there can sometimes be a disconnect there. And so I'm not going to tell anybody how to cook there. It's just, I grappled with that a lot. I have a lot of empathy towards menu writing, and I don't necessarily think that there's like maybe one right answer, but I think directionally, I lean much more on concepts being the thing to be the center of the orbit versus the individual chef.
Very cool. Can you give me like an example of the difference of those two things in just a little more context behind those?
Totally. So I think about like some of the more successful concepts we're seeing now. I think one of the big ones in New York right now is like anything carbone related is just like, it's the pillar of just kind of like hard to get into. Impossible to get a table at Teresi right now. But I think obviously with the name being kind of like the Carbone, kind of like family being involved there. If we take just Teresi as an example, I think Teresi as a concept is really interesting because you have the ability to look at that as a concept and filter dishes through would this make sense at Teresi? Same with French Laundry, right? Where it's like you can take a look at that and just ask that as a almost flow chart of a question to kind of take yourself all the way down, versus this idea of this dynamically changing individual, which is the chef, where it's kind of like, put this person on a plate, like the very slow motion chef's table. Do you know what I mean? It gets memed to death because it is a little bit of an eye roll thing. Those things, the chef putting themselves on the plate, and you need this backstory to understand the dish in order to kind of like, maybe even the flavors don't make that much sense. The concept is much more of a, you feel like you're there. It's kind of like, I can't get this anywhere else. And I'm so hyped in 2025 on this idea of like providing a good experience to people. And I think concepts can do that more consistently than the chef. Because think about it this way. If you go to a restaurant and it's all about the chef cooking that dish, and the chef's not there that night, I know for me, I sometimes have that feeling of just kind of like, well, is it going to be different if the chef's not here cooking the thing? And so it turns into this interesting, dilemma that you have, where I think chefs would be better off being able to have their ideas come to fruition via the concept, as opposed to having it be this thing that is kind of like, this is me on a plate. Because I don't think that ever ends up landing anyways.
Sure. I think it can be tied to like restaurant success and business growth. Thomas Keller can't be in Napa and in New York at the same time, right?
And he's not. And I think that surprises people when they hear about like, oh, Thomas, and I've been sharing this on other shows that I've been going on lately, which is like, as I've gotten older, I saw Chef Keller being this person who was like this technique savant, and he was this master of, just kind of like combining modern French and modern American influences, blah, 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 blah. He is a phenomenal operator. Like his ability to kind of just like hire people better than him and put infrastructure in place where the menu can change every day and have consistency across these multiple locations in the, not just his 3-star places, but the other restaurants that he owns. And he doesn't have a perfect track record either, right? Like he's had places that have closed and gone out of business, unfortunately, or business deals that haven't worked out. But I think when we think about like a career as a chef owner, I still don't think anybody's come close to what he's been able to do.
In terms of consistency, just across not only decades and coasts and all of that, but just being able to keep that high level of, people still go because they want to experience it every day.
And how much is that a testament to people still want to go even though he's not there? I think that's super interesting. And it's almost like the organization, this is no knock to him, but like, it's almost like the organization got better when he took a step back. And I think you see this problem with a lot of chefs where they're just kind of like, they're so dug their heels in of like, it's better when I'm around, or anybody who's been in a management position where you don't have all the frameworks in place and the culture is not right. And there's almost this fear of just kind of like, oh, things are going to go to kaput if I'm not there. Like that's a really negative place to be. And so I spend my time kind of trying to think about like working with chefs who get excited about having businesses like that. Because listen, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be behind the pass every night. And you can run a really successful organization doing that. Again, it's not necessarily the type of kitchen that I want to own in the future.
That makes sense. The chefs of that level where there is a cultural personality around them, right? It doesn't have to be that. It can just be, I own a popular spot in town, right? I want to step away because I just had a kid, or I am tired and I want to expand the business and provide more opportunities. And I think that's just a really interesting way of looking at things and seeing how things can improve when you do step away, because, you had the idea, you got it off the ground, but you can't just do it all by yourself.
And going macro, how much would that inspire more people to join the industry if they knew that was the escape velocity that you could reach in your career? Because I think a lot of people get so kind of like hesitant about running the restaurant and oh my goodness, do I really want a restaurant? Do I really want to own that thing? And I think because we make the top of the mountain, you're standing at the pass every night in perfectly starched whites with the tweezers in your hand, and you're just kind of like, you're the one doing quality control every night because you're petrified at the fact that one of your line cooks is going to send out something that's not up to snuff with, again, what you look like on a plate. And so I think just reframing what we see that pinnacle of success looking like, I just agonize over where we got lost and why, we have this example. We have this again, why has nobody else been able to do 2 different coasts or 2 different cities, 3 Michelin star restaurants? So you have examples in France, right? Like you have Alain Ducasse, you have Gordon Ramsay in the UK, like multiple 3-star places. And I just don't know if people aspire to get to that level, whether they think that it's kind of like there's this cult of personality that goes behind it, or I have to sell out, quote unquote, at some point in time to do that, or any of these things. But I think we would get people more excited about continuing to further their career as a chef, and they would bow out a little bit less if they knew that they could actually push for that a little bit more. And so that's what I'm like, with the things that I teach in Repertoire, like that's what I really try to emphasize. And what I'm, again, continuing to build towards as I expand beyond just being a line cook is like, how do I, because that's all it is. I firmly believe that Thomas Keller just has a different set of skills than you or I do. It's not that he has this just kind of like, it's not a genetic advantage that he has. He just has more skills, more time in the industry than any of us do. And he was able to thoughtfully build in a way where he just could stay relentlessly focused on the French Laundry as a concept. And that's what has allowed him to have the success that he's had.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to take a little bit of jump over to kind of the content creation side of things. You transitioned from those pop-ups and into more of a full-time content creating role. Is that a fair?
Absolutely. Well, in the beginning, it was not that way. I was doing pop-ups. I was working on a food truck, actually, because my pop-ups were like too sporadic and some of them were not profitable. Like some of them, they would do great, but some of them I was just like, whether it was I paid a little bit too much in costs, or I was trying out a new venue, or I went for a really ambitious, longer tasting menu and I spent a lot on ingredients, or I tried to do more staffing. They weren't profitable. So I was working on a food truck. And in the early days of content, this was like before any of the platforms had heavier monetization things, or sponsors weren't even really interested in a channel like mine back in the day. And so monetization on content was really hard too. And so I was like juggling 3 jobs basically at the time to try to like make ends meet. And so it eventually was able to get to the place where like my channel got big enough where I could make the switch. But yeah, content creator now, it's hard because I do a lot of consulting for, like chefs and restaurants now too. So it's like, what do I call myself is like, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, you can call yourself a content creator. You can call yourself an educator. I think that's the cool part is that you are a bunch of different things, right? And you've been able to take the education of being just, being a cook and cooking kitchens and really parlay that into a lot of interesting and exciting avenues. And I think that that's also something that's relatively new in this industry over the past, let's say 10 years or so. 10 years, I mean, how old is YouTube? 20 years? 10 years? I don't know. Something like that. But yeah, I'm curious, what are you seeing when it comes to, and then I do want to get into Repertoire and what you're doing with that, but what are you seeing like on the hospitality content creation side? What's exciting you and where are the opportunities?
So I come at this from 2 angles. One is what I call this kind of like in the head knowledge that exists out there in the industry. There are a lot of like unspoken rules in hospitality that when you go and work at a restaurant, it's kind of like you're going to learn it the hard way on day 1, or you're going to learn it during this very painful, just like grueling process over time. And I think because I lived through this, I was only able to put out, I think, like 1 video a month when I was a sous chef at Lee's Firkit, putting out dish of the day content. Because it was like, again, I was working 12 hours a day. I was at the pass expediting every night. I was having to do mise en place checks on everybody. I was butchering the proteins and worrying about staff meal. And so it's like, I have a lot of empathy towards chefs that are working in restaurants making content. And in a lot of ways, I had to give myself a little bit of grace there to be able to say like, oh, like you had this real job and you're doing the content side. And you look at individual organizations like Fallow, where those chefs are able to put out a ton of content and have the restaurants that they have, which is really, really impressive. I wasn't able to do it. And so kudos to them. But I think it's what is something that would help a budding, young, beginner set of lessons and knowledge pieces that we all know, things like cutting the tape or, how to brunoise or, like butchering a chicken or how to set up your station. All of those insights are just now being able to be discovered on the internet because people are putting out individual pieces of content. Or there's this guy on Instagram who like basically vlogged every single lesson he learned at his externship at Per Se and just puts it out there. It's just kind of like, oh, and it's funny because I was an extern at Per Se, so I look at what he's teaching and it's like, oh yeah, I had to learn that the frickin' hard way. And I think some people look at that and it's like, oh, well, he's just putting out these hoity-toity fine dining things. But I look at that and I'm like, man, that would have helped me so much. And that's honestly, when I started off, it was the ethos that I structured my content around is what would help young culinary school Justin? What was he interested in? What were the things that I think, like would have helped at that point in time? There's that side of approaching content creation. And then there's the other side, which is kind of like, what is this thing that is still an outstanding problem that has yet to be solved? And so that's where I think the person like me comes in, because I love figuring out the rules. I love figuring out what works and what doesn't. Where's the feedback, like hitting and what could potentially be changed, the kind of like Kaizen, improve 1% better every day kind of piece. I love making frameworks for things. And so what are the new things that can be created? And when we think about content creation, the word it's in the word there, that people who have the mind for that can come up with things, figure something out, and then use content to kind of like put it out there and make the whole industry better. And so those two things, like in tandem, teaching what you kind of already know the kind of like, as you're climbing the ladder, helping somebody who is one or two rungs beneath you. I think that's really, really valuable because some people go their entire career never doing that. And then they get to the end and then they're in these biography interviews and they're asking about, like, what was it like back then? And by then it's 15 years have gone by and you don't have the ability to empathize with those problems. But I think about that other set, the creating solutions to problems, that is really exciting for me because when we think about entrepreneurship, that's all it is. It's finding a problem and coming up with a solution that you can offer to the market. And so that's where I get really excited. And that's what I spend my time doing now is just kind of like why I get seeing the work that you guys do with like putting out those industry reports. Because if we really boil it down, you guys are highlighting a myriad of problems that still exist in the industry. And it's like, how can we potentially, like I look at those reports through the lens of, how can I put out a product that helps with this? How can I put out a framework or, like put together a resource that can not make this problem go away entirely, but potentially mitigate some of the downsides, help people to make better decisions, avoid some of these pitfalls. And so those are the two places that at least I approach my content from. And then there's people who do the, like the how-tos, the recipe guides, those things. I think those are also really, really interesting. I just don't I spend more time trying to help people improve their business or become better, higher performers, because I think that leads to better experiences for guests. And then the flywheel can just continue to go around. But yeah, it's still so young. And so I that's why I get so excited being in this space.
Absolutely. And you're occupying a unique, a niche there where it is, kind of the business frameworks and bettering yourself, I think, as a chef. And, there's folks, like you said, there's Fallow, a restaurant group they're running two restaurants, but they're also kind of doing more of the like viral YouTube-y style of things. And they have, I just looked at, almost 1 million subscribers, right? Which is wild. And, they're doing some of the teaching stuff like mother sauces. They're ranking, I'm just like ranking British dishes and poached eggs. And they also have these cool like POV, like first person camera videos, and
awesome to watch.
They're addicting. And it's interesting to see the variation in styles of restaurant and cooking content creation. There's like the classic, chef or foodie type person turned, I do recipes and now I have a cookbook and YouTube channel and folks like that. But then there's folks like yourself that are doing more of the business side. And I just think it's super cool.
And just the acceptance of it, right? Like I had to do an externship manual at Per Se, and we needed to basically take pictures of dishes to include in the externship manual. And at the time I had this cheap Canon DSLR camera that I brought in, and I got made fun of. Like the chef de parties were laughing at me when I brought in this camera of like, you taking pictures of the food, like that type of, and now it's just understood that if we're hosting a collaborative pop-up, chef's going to come in 2 hours early and there's going to be lights set up and he's going to be mic'd up and he's going to come around and he's going to talk about what's happening with the pop-up, and the camera might turn on me and they might ask me, hey chef, what are you making today? It's just a totally different landscape for how people think about running their businesses. And I think it's awesome because what's a really hard part about running a business is like new customers, getting new customers in. And if you can form a relationship with people before they even get that butt in the seat, it's just a totally different experience for people. And so again, there's people who push back on it and say that content has like tainted the industry in some way, shape or form. I just think like net on the long enough time horizon, I think the industry is going to be better for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think as much as I see, I'm like, there should be more, for this industry in particular. So I'm curious. I want to talk about Repertoire a little bit. You talked about the education content. So, what were the gaps? I think the gaps in like the traditional culinary school route that you saw that inspired you to start Repertoire, and just share kind of what you're hoping to achieve through that program and the newsletter and the YouTube channel, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I had this really perplexing moment when I graduated my culinary school where, one, the organization basically didn't really want me to go into fine dining. They took a look at the path that I wanted to go down, and I wanted a 3 Michelin star restaurant of my own someday. And I basically wanted to get experience at those types of places because I wasn't coming from a place of knowing that much. And so I put my hand up and said, I want to go to these places. And, my school basically didn't have that many resources for me to go to some of these places because early on for my externship, for example, it was unpaid. And the school didn't like that because, and I understand why they didn't like it, because if you're on an unpaid internship and you don't have the ability to go back to school and finish your degree, that's lost, tuition for them. And so that's a really, negative situation there. But even going into some of these kitchens, it's kind of like the stuff that I learned at culinary school didn't necessarily, it's not that none of it served me. It wasn't enough. So I got into some of these kitchens and it was just kind of like, how you thought about station construction, how you thought about how you move, like your sense of urgency was just not enough. And so some of those gaps that I had was like, that's how I used the scratch my own itch. Like what would have helped me is how I basically started like my total station nomination program and being able to take a step back and really ask myself, like, is your ability to make hollandaise sauce the thing that's going to make you excel on the station? Or is it like the first module of total station nomination is instruction following? Because listen, you might not even get a recipe at your first day in a fine dining kitchen. You might basically get like a case of parsley and you might just get told, I need it picked like this and I need it washed like this and I need it put away like this. And it's like, okay, interesting. There's no recipe here. How do I make sure that I'm doing it right in a way that's going to make the chef de partie that I'm helping happy and ultimately set me up for the opportunity to ultimately get promoted to garde manger in 3 months' time? And so those are interesting things where it's like, is there something that's taught in traditional culinary school that might provide value, but is that maybe necessarily the best place to start? I don't know. It's an interesting question. And that's kind of like what I spend my time doing. And then I think that there's also the piece of the evaluation and how we basically qualify education in hospitality and in organizations in general. I was talking to somebody who, I won't share their name, but they basically run a whole country's section of the trade school, ecosystem. So plumbers and chefs and electricians and all those sorts of things. And he was sharing with me this insight that a lot of the education that currently exists in those institutions comes from this very measurable, did I teach you how to brunoise? Did I teach you about the mother sauces? In a practical exam, if you can make a piece of poached sole with this mother sauce and this garnish, I can now say I did my job, check mark, did a good job. And he was like, what's so interesting about your program is you actually talk about like things like attitude and communication and organization and all these things that like chefs care about. We know we care about them, but nobody's put a framework around how to evaluate a line cook coming into their organization on how good is this person at XYZ things that I end up caring about. And so coming up with the 9 domination measures, people can get their station score and see how are they performing on their station. So that's, one piece of just, can we measure this? Asking myself that question. And then if the answer is yes, how can we make it so that I give that as a resource to the restaurant where they can now have a bird's eye view of this is how my team is doing. And how does that make management better, right? Like I can sit down with somebody. I've had sit downs with both line cooks that I've been managing and as the chef de partie, my sous chef sitting across from me and saying, hey, things aren't really going that well right now. And then I'm just kind of like, I put my hands up and I'm just like, I just can't get set up for service on time. And that is a very like demoralizing place to be where you're just kind of like, I was reading that in the report that you guys made earlier, where it's like reinvesting into training, giving feedback, those sorts of things are so like the industry is saying we want that, but barring actually a framework of questions, I think that it's very hard to scale that. And so me being able to offer that as a bundled, here's a way to visualize it and track it over time is really, really valuable. So that's number one. And then number two is coming up to now, the onus on the education has often been on the individual because of how I think institutionalized college education has been in the US. But where I've actually found more success is going straight to businesses and saying, hey, is this a program that I can just put your whole staff through? And now it's a win-win-win across the board because I obviously as the business, it's easier to sell B2B sometimes than it is B2C. I prove it B2C, but then I actually bring it to market B2B. The business benefits because they can show direct ROI. And then the entire staff basically doesn't have to throw their hands up and say, I'm only making $17 an hour. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, now this is an actual benefit that my employer is pouring into me. And so it's just a fundamentally different way to kind of like approach education and how it gets infused into the industry.
Very interesting. So now, I mean, you're creating the content and you create all the content yourself, correct?
That's right.
So you're creating the content and now you're working on ways to not replace, but supplement the traditional educational model of, the culinary school, trade school.
Totally. I kind of played around with this idea of like, do I do a replacement for culinary school? But I think it's too different to actually end up ultimately calling that. The thing that I get more excited about is my wife works in healthcare and she has to do something called continuing education as she continues to maintain her license. And I think that's a much better parallel to draw here, rather than a replacement for culinary school or anything like that. Because as we think about ultimately bettering yourself as a professional, it's like, why don't we do that as an industry? Or I even think about somebody submitted their station score. I got it yesterday morning. And it was somebody who went from a more casual restaurant to a higher, like more fine dining place. And their station score came in and it was worse. And I was like, interesting. This person went from a more casual place where they were crushing it. And now they went to an organization where the standards were higher, their workload was more, they had more tasks that they had to juggle. And yeah, they got worse. Like their evaluation went down. But now they have the ability to see exactly where I need to make improvements across any of the 9 measures that I track. And I think that's a much more, again, sustainable way. I get so upset when I hear about people like burning out and leaving the industry, because I look at that and I'm just kind of like, what could we have done better for that person to have either retained them longer or given them more, or, like supplemented their motivation, more education, more support. That's where I think people struggle, is like it all just turns into this negative spiral all the way down, because the quality of product gets worse. The chef is spending more time training than creating. All of these things just start to compound. And yeah, I understand why people that work in the industry are tired. And so I'm trying to like be the counterweight on the other side of the scale to help there wherever I can.
Nice. And I mean, yeah, it's providing those frameworks and making it easier for that continuing education to exist. Like you said, your wife's in healthcare, and healthcare, they're not just coming up with these random things on their own. There's like these very structured programs and trainings and things that folks are going through. And that's cross, you can go to work at a different hospital in a different practice and it's the same stuff, right? Very cool. So as we're kind of wrapping up a time here, I want to just see, you started in this content creation thing. What advice would you give to someone young who's working in the industry, who's like, I want to make content about my job, I don't know. What advice would you give that person?
I think you can do a lot with a kind of like post-production workflow on the things that you're already doing. So the place where I obviously start with most folks is the Gary Vee advice of document, don't create. Because that's a really, really kind of like solidifying place to be when you're thinking about content. Because if you're doing that, like, let's say you're working a vegetable station at a 1 Michelin star restaurant, it's very difficult to come at content creation from a place of authority, because you're going to get those comments, right? Of like, you don't have a restaurant yet. Why should I listen to you? Those types of things. And so if you're basically saying, this is just how my life is, as a person running a station on the veg station at a 1 Michelin star restaurant, nobody can argue with that. And so I think that's a really, really interesting place to be. Alex Hormozi has this insight of, don't say how to, say how I. And so instead of how to set up your station, this is how I set up my station. And that's a really interesting place to start. I also talked with this really interesting woman who documented her whole culinary school journey. And all of that content was shooting content, basically setting up her phone, recording herself butchering a fish. And then after class, she would do a voiceover and post it as content. And so I think if you're at this weird place where you're looking at the fallow guys and you're saying, hey, this executive chef can stand at the pass and he can do the hosting thing and be all charismatic on video and he's mic'd up and I don't have that, you can take a look at some of these other examples where they're documenting individual things that are happening throughout their day. And if you have insights to share that might help whoever your audience happens to be, you can do that in post, is the thing that I try to remind people of. And then the other thing that again, you might not be producing the content now, but capture the content now. Because if there's a word from the wise, I wish I had content of my first week at Grace. I wish I had videos of me, shingling rose petals at Noma when I was on my stage there. I wish I had the ability to show doing all the juicing projects that I had to do at the start of my day on my externship at Per Se felt like and looked like, and what the kitchen looked, how it was structured. I don't have any of that content. And so now all of this stuff that I'm sharing is basically just stories that I basically have to try to, animated and tell, because I don't have any sort of like visual backup. And part of it was like cameras weren't as good back then, but it's also just like, I didn't have the confidence or the gusto to set up a camera and just record myself doing some of this stuff. And kudos to the people who do have that foresight now. Even the people who just kind of like, if you have any ambition to own your own place someday or put out your insights and ultimately help the industry from a mentorship perspective someday, set up your phone and capture 30 seconds of it, because the lesson is going to land so much harder when you have that. It's receipts. You're capturing receipts and you can show people the receipts in 6 years when you put out your first video.
Awesome. Justin, just so we can wrap things up nicely, if people want to find out what you're up to, where can they find you? Reach out about Repertoire, want to check out your content, where should they go?
Yeah, so I'm at Justin Khanna almost on every platform. That's YouTube and Instagram, and JustinKhanna.com is my personal website, but then joinrepertoire.com is the place where people can go to find the podcast and Total Station Domination as a course. And I do a fun series of newsletters that I'm really high on right now called Tickets, where I basically put out like a quick idea and then just kind of like a response at the end where people can just kind of like give their insights, and it's a little bit more conversational for folks there. And if there's anything on the one-on-one side that people want to talk through, just feel free to send me an email.
Awesome, Justin. Thank you so much. And we'll put all the links there in the show notes. But thanks for hopping on today, and
thanks so much for having me.